Snow draped the Carpathian mountains like a burial shroud, muffling the world in silence. But from the looming silhouette of Csejte Castle, silence was not peace. It was menace. The villagers whispered of girls who entered those gates and never returned. They spoke of screams that pierced the night, of shadows moving across torchlit windows, of a mistress whose beauty seemed frozen in time while others withered and died. At the heart of the whispers was one name, Elizabeth Báthory. 2. The outside world. She was every inch the noblewoman, countess of immense wealth, cousin to a king, a woman cloaked in silks and authority. But beneath that polished veneer lurked a legend that would outlive empires. History branded her the Blood Countess, the woman who, according to rumor, tortured and killed hundreds of young girls in her quest for eternal youth. They said she bathed in their blood, that she delighted in cruelty, that her hunger for beauty turned into a thirst for death. Imagine her, raven black hair cascading down her pale shoulders, jewels glittering at her throat, her eyes like daggers that sliced through the souls of those who dared meet her gaze. In the flicker of candlelight, she seemed more spectre than human, an empress of shadows ruling not with compassion, but with terror. And yet, the tale of Elizabeth Báthory is not so simple. For every account that paints her as a monster, there is another that suggests she was the victim of a grand political conspiracy. She belonged to one of the most powerful dynasties in Central Europe, a family whose enemies were many and merciless. Was she truly the sadistic predator whispered of in taverns and courtrooms? Or was she a pawn destroyed by men who feared her influence, her wealth, and her independence in a world ruled by patriarchs? The truth is buried beneath centuries of fear and fascination. What survives is a chilling motif: myth, cruelty, and eternal youth. Hers is a story where fact and legend entwine like the coils of a serpent, impossible to separate. Did she commit unspeakable acts, or was she trapped in a web of rumor so grotesque it consumed her legacy? Either way, Elizabeth Báthory became more than a woman. She became a symbol of power corrupted, of beauty cursed, of ambition twisted into horror. Her name still lingers like an echo across the centuries. It clings to the stone walls of Csejte Castle. It chills the air in the villages that once lived in her shadow. And it bleeds into literature, myth, and modern pop culture. When we speak of vampires, of eternal youth bought with blood, it is her ghost we summon. Tonight, we step through the iron gates of her castle. We descend into the corridors where truth is indistinguishable from nightmare. We walk into a world where torchlight flickers against damp stone, where the air smells of fear, and where one woman's legacy has been written not in ink, but in crimson. This is not just history. This is legend forged in terror. This is the story of Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess. The legend of Elizabeth Báthory did not begin in the blood-stained corridors of Csejte Castle. It began in the gilded halls of the most powerful dynasty in Hungary, where privilege and brutality mingled like wine and poison. Born in 1560 in Bathe, Elizabeth entered the world wrapped in silk but shadowed by whispers. Her family, the Báthorys, was one of the oldest and richest noble houses in Central Europe. They were warriors, landowners, rulers of vast estates, and, most dangerously, players in a game of politics that made enemies as quickly as it forged alliances. From her earliest days, Elizabeth was marked by two legacies: unimaginable power and disturbing rumor. Her bloodline alone was a tapestry of violence and prestige. Her uncle was Stephen Báthory, who would rise to become King of Poland. Her cousins held military commands, controlled castles, and enforced their will with the iron fist of nobility. Yet her lineage also carried darker stains. Some whispered of madness, of cruelty passed down like a family heirloom. Others spoke of strange practices, of a clan whose power seemed too absolute, too unnatural, to be innocent. Elizabeth's childhood was not one of carefree games or maternal warmth. Instead, it was a childhood forged in iron. As a girl of noble birth, she was expected to embody strength, discipline, and obedience. Tutors drilled her in Latin, German, and Hungarian, ensuring she could converse in the languages of power. She studied scripture, politics, and the intricacies of courtly behavior. But Elizabeth was no passive student. Even in her youth, she displayed a sharp mind and a fiery will, traits that set her apart from other noble daughters trained merely to smile and obey. She was ambitious, headstrong, and unyielding. Yet behind her polished education lay a darker education, one that would leave indelible scars on her soul. The Hungary of Elizabeth's childhood was a land scarred by endless wars with the Ottoman Empire. Violence was not an abstraction, it was a daily reality. Public executions, torture of prisoners, and brutal displays of justice were common spectacles. Children of noble families were not shielded from these horrors. They were expected to watch, to learn, to understand that power was enforced not by words, but by blood. Some accounts, though embroidered by later storytellers, claim Elizabeth witnessed acts that would haunt any child. One story describes how, as a young girl, she saw a man sewn alive into the stomach of a dying horse as punishment for rebellion. Another tale whispers that she watched servants beaten or mutilated for the smallest mistakes. Whether these stories are fact or legend, they reflect the truth of her environment. Cruelty was not hidden, it was normalized. Elizabeth grew up in a world where suffering was spectacle, where authority was synonymous with terror. Her family life was no sanctuary. The Báthorys were plagued by instability and whispers of incestuous marriages meant to preserve their bloodline. Some historians suggest Elizabeth may have suffered from epileptic fits as a child, a condition poorly understood at the time. Treatments for such ailments were as brutal as the disease itself. Animal blood, potions brewed with strange herbs, rituals that blurred the line between medicine and superstition. Imagine the impression left on a young girl, learning that her own body was a battlefield between life, death, and arcane remedies. Despite this, Elizabeth was not without charm or intelligence. She was said to be strikingly beautiful even as a child, with dark eyes that held a piercing intensity. She learned quickly, read voraciously, and exhibited a precocious talent for manipulation. Those around her recognized that she was not a girl to be underestimated. She had the wit of a scholar and the will of a soldier. But beneath that brilliance, a seed of cruelty may already have been planted, not out of natural malice, but out of the environment that shaped her. At the age of 10, Elizabeth's life took a decisive turn. She was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a nobleman of immense wealth and military prestige. The betrothal was less about love than about alliance. The Báthorys and the Nadasdys were two titanic houses, and their union would cement their dominance over Hungary. Elizabeth, still a child, was already being shaped into a weapon of dynastic ambition. Her body, her future, her very identity, these were not hers to command. They belonged to her family's designs. In preparation for her role as the wife of Ferenc, Elizabeth was sent to live with the Nadasdy family. There, she was exposed to yet another layer of aristocratic life. Discipline sharpened into cruelty, hierarchy maintained by fear. Ferenc himself was away much of the time, leading campaigns against the Ottomans. But the household into which Elizabeth was thrust was one steeped in violence, its traditions forged on the battlefield. It was said that the Nadasdy estate kept executioners among its staff, men who specialized in creative punishments. For Elizabeth, such horrors no longer shocked, they instructed. Some sources, later exaggerated by folklore, suggest that Elizabeth may have had her first brush with sadism during this period. Stories whisper that she took a perverse fascination in punishments inflicted on disobedient servants, that she learned from the cruelty of those around her, not with revulsion, but with curiosity. Again, whether these tales are truth or propaganda, they reflect the image of a girl shaped by the brutal context of her world. At 14, Elizabeth married Ferenc in a grand ceremony attended by thousands. The wedding was a spectacle of wealth and power, Endless banquets, parades of nobles, the fusion of two dynasties, celebrated with a magnificence befitting royalty. As a wedding gift, Ferenc presented Elizabeth with Csejte Castle, a fortress that would one day become infamous as the stage of her darkest deeds. But on that day, it was not a prison of screams. It was a symbol of triumph. Elizabeth Báthory, barely a teenager, stood at the center of Hungary's aristocracy, cloaked in jewels, crowned with ambition, and married into a future that promised both power and peril. Her childhood had ended. Whatever innocence might have lingered in her heart had been buried beneath layers of discipline, violence, and expectation. She was no longer a girl watching cruelty from the shadows. She was a countess, a woman of power, and soon a mistress of her own domain. And as the gates of Csejte Castle closed behind her, so too did the gates of destiny. Elizabeth Báthory was no longer a child of her family's making. She was becoming a legend of her own. The marriage of Elizabeth Báthory to Ferenc Nadasdy was more than a union of two nobles. It was the fusion of two dynasties, a consolidation of wealth, land, and power so immense that it shook the foundations of Hungary's aristocracy. Yet, what made the union unforgettable was not merely the grandeur of the wedding, but the transformation it sparked within Elizabeth herself. With Ferenc's armies fighting on the frontier against the Turks, the young countess began to rule in her husband's absence. At just 14, Elizabeth stepped into a role that required command, cunning, and the iron will of a sovereign. Ferenc Nadasdy was a soldier above all else. Known as the Black Knight of Hungary, he earned his reputation in the long and bloody wars against the Ottoman Empire. Tales of his cruelty on the battlefield became legend. Impaled prisoners, mutilated captives, and merciless raids that left villages in ashes. Some whispered that he was more butcher than noble, a man who lived only for the thrill of slaughter. Elizabeth, by contrast, was refined, educated, and aristocratic. But opposites can be dangerously complementary. Where Ferenc taught the art of war, Elizabeth brought the sophistication of court politics. Together, they became a couple, both feared and admired. He the iron fist, she the velvet glove hiding the dagger. In Ferenc's long absences, Elizabeth managed the estates, a responsibility that extended over vast lands and thousands of peasants. She proved herself adept at governance, resolving disputes, overseeing harvests, and even administering justice. To her tenants, she was not merely a distant noble, she was an ever-present figure of authority. But her justice was not tempered with mercy. Already, there were murmurs of her severity, whispers that disobedient servants often disappeared, that punishments under her hand were unusually harsh. Elizabeth's role as a noblewoman also brought her into the inner circles of European aristocracy. She maintained correspondence with other powerful women, sharing knowledge of herbs, medicines, and the occult sciences. In an age where superstition mingled with science, Elizabeth stood out as unusually knowledgeable. She was fluent in Latin, German, and Greek, and her library at Csejte Castle was said to be filled with works of alchemy, astrology, and medical treatises. To some, she was a woman of rare intellect. To others, her fascination with strange texts and remedies was unsettling, the mark of a mind wandering into forbidden territories. At court, Elizabeth dazzled. She was strikingly beautiful, with sharp cheekbones, raven dark hair, and eyes that seemed to pierce through pretense. Chroniclers, even those hostile to her, acknowledged her allure. She knew how to command attention, how to manipulate with charm as well as with intimidation. When Ferenc returned from war, the pair appeared as Hungary's golden couple, warrior and countess, ruthless yet resplendent. Together, they built a reputation of dominance, not only over their estates, but within the hierarchy of Hungarian nobility. But behind this glittering facade, shadows gathered. Elizabeth's exposure to her husband's methods of punishment left its mark. Ferenc, amused by his young wife's curiosity, reportedly taught her techniques of torture used on the battlefield. One tale insists he demonstrated how to smear honey on a prisoner and tie him outside, leaving the victim to be devoured by insects under the sun. Whether apocryphal or not, such stories suggest that Elizabeth was no passive observer. She was learning, absorbing, and perhaps taking pleasure in these lessons. By her late teens, Elizabeth was already a woman of formidable reputation. Servants feared her stern gaze, nobles respected her intellect, and the common people, bound to her estates, spoke of her with the mixture of awe and terror reserved for those who held absolute power over their lives. Yet she was not simply feared, she was admired. She was a patron of the arts, a woman who cultivated beauty in her surroundings, who could converse with poets and scholars as easily as with soldiers and priests. Her rise was not one of brute force alone. It was also one of charisma and cultivated image. In 1604, tragedy struck. Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight, succumbed to illness after years of war. Elizabeth, at 44, was left a widow. The death of her husband marked a turning point, for without his shadow, Elizabeth stood alone at the helm of her vast empire. No longer merely the wife of a soldier, she was the sovereign mistress of immense lands, wealth, and influence. Her authority was unquestioned, her position unassailable. Yet this was the moment when the rumours, once whispers in the dark, began to grow louder. Servants vanished. Families spoke of daughters sent to Csejte Castle, never to return. Officials, who dared question her, were silenced, bribed, or disappeared themselves. The image of the cultured noblewoman began to fracture, replaced by the legend of the Blood Countess. Elizabeth's rise to fame, then, was twofold. Publicly, she was a paragon of nobility, brilliant, beautiful, powerful, a woman who managed estates larger than some kingdoms. Privately, she was becoming a figure of dread, her name entwined with tales of cruelty, obsession, and a thirst for youth that bordered on the unnatural. By the time she was in her 40s, she was one of the most powerful women in Europe, admired by monarchs and feared by peasants alike. But fame built on terror is fragile. The very traits that made Elizabeth untouchable, the wealth, the beauty, the cunning, also made her vulnerable to envy and suspicion, and as whispers of her cruelty spread, they set the stage for her eventual downfall. Elizabeth Báthory had risen from noble child to countess, from consort of a warrior to sovereign mistress of her own empire. But in that rise lay the seeds of her doom. For power, when mixed with cruelty and ambition, does not create stability, it creates legend. And legends, once loosed upon the world, are impossible to contain. The death of Ferenc Nadasdy left Elizabeth Báthory in a position of unprecedented autonomy. As the widow of the Black Knight, she inherited vast estates, commanded the loyalty of retainers, and wielded influence that few women in Europe could dream of. But with Ferenc gone, a crucial check on her darker impulses also vanished. The Black Knight had been brutal, yes, but his violence was focused outward, on the battlefield. Elizabeth's violence, left unchecked, began to turn inward into the very heart of her household. It started, as so many dark tales do, with whispers. Servants spoke of punishments that exceeded reason. Young maids beaten until their bodies were broken, girls stripped naked and left in the snow, needles driven under fingernails for the smallest mistakes. Some dismissed these as exaggerations. Peasants were always eager to invent stories about their lords. Yet the rumours grew, feeding on themselves, becoming too numerous to ignore. Elizabeth's obsession, according to legend, began with vanity. One tale claims that after a servant girl accidentally tugged her hair while brushing it, Elizabeth struck her so hard that blood spattered on her hand. When she wiped it away, she believed her skin looked younger, smoother, more radiant. From that moment, the Countess became convinced that blood was the secret to eternal youth. The story is almost too grotesque to be true, but it stuck, repeated in taverns and whispered in kitchens, until it became inseparable from her myth. Whether or not Elizabeth truly believed in blood as a cosmetic, there is little doubt that her punishments grew more elaborate, more cruel. Survivors claimed she used instruments of torture: iron pincers, branding irons, even cages lined with spikes. Girls from the peasantry were lured to the castle with promises of work, only to vanish into its dark chambers. Some accounts suggest that the walls of Csejte Castle themselves seemed to absorb the screams of the victims, echoing long after the torments ceased. But it was not only peasants who began to disappear. When Elizabeth's appetite extended to the daughters of minor nobles, young women of respectable families, the rumors turned into accusations. Noble parents demanded answers. Where had their daughters gone? Why had they entered Csejte Castle, but never returned? For the first time, Elizabeth's brutality threatened not just peasants, who had little voice, but the aristocracy itself. The Countess's accomplices became notorious in their own right. A handful of loyal servants, including a nurse named Ilona Jo and a sadistic dwarf called Fitzko, allegedly assisted in her deeds. They carried out her orders, restrained her victims, and disposed of the bodies. Their loyalty was secured by fear as much as by privilege. In Elizabeth's world, disobedience was rewarded with the same fate as betrayal. And yet, even amidst this spiral of cruelty, Elizabeth maintained her mask of nobility. She continued to correspond with scholars, to host dignitaries, to present herself as a refined widow managing her estates. But behind the grand feasts and glittering receptions, the darkness festered. Those who worked within her household described a world divided. On one side, the elegant salons and banquets of a countess. On the other, the secret chambers where pain was inflicted in pursuit of beauty. By the early 1600s, the volume of complaints had grown impossible to ignore. The Hungarian king, Matthias II, received petitions from nobles whose daughters had disappeared. Local pastors reported that parishioners were terrified, convinced that the Countess was in league with dark forces. The legend of the Blood Countess had spread beyond Hungary, reaching courts across Europe. Elizabeth was no longer merely a wealthy widow. She was a scandal, a danger, an embarrassment to the nobility. But there was another, less sensational motive behind her downfall: money. Elizabeth had lent large sums to the crown, and Matthias found himself heavily indebted to her. If she were found guilty of crimes, her estates could be confiscated and her debts to the crown erased. Thus began the official investigation, not merely a pursuit of justice, but a convenient solution to a financial problem. In 1610, the Palatine of Hungary, György Thurzó, was ordered to investigate. His inquiries uncovered testimony from more than 300 witnesses. Servants described gruesome punishments. Parents spoke of daughters who never returned. Local officials recounted how bodies were hurriedly buried in shallow graves around the castle. Thurzó gathered enough evidence to act, and in December of that year, he stormed Csejte Castle. What he claimed to find was shocking. According to reports, Thurzó and his men caught Elizabeth in the act, with mutilated girls strewn across the castle. Whether this was literal truth or a dramatic flourish remains debated by historians, but the image stuck. The Countess, surrounded by broken bodies, the mask of nobility ripped away to reveal a monster. Elizabeth was not subjected to a public trial. Her rank made such a spectacle too dangerous. Instead, her accomplices bore the brunt of the punishment. Ilona Jo and the others were executed with brutal swiftness, their confessions extracted under torture. Elizabeth herself was spared execution, but condemned to a fate perhaps worse for one of her pride: permanent confinement. The once mighty Countess was sealed inside her castle, her windows bricked over, her world reduced to a handful of dark chambers. She, who had commanded armies of servants, was left alone with her thoughts, her vanity, and the shadows of her deeds. The woman who had sought eternal youth found herself entombed alive, aging in darkness as the world outside whispered her name with horror. Her downfall was not merely the collapse of a life, it was the birth of a legend. The Blood Countess, the woman who bathed in blood, the Hungarian vampire, Whether every detail was true or exaggerated mattered little. The story had taken on a life of its own, one that would outlast Elizabeth herself. The winter of 1610 sealed Elizabeth Báthory's fate. Once the mistress of vast lands, the mistress of Csejte, she now found herself reduced to a prisoner within her own castle walls. There was no grand trial for the Countess, no spectacle of justice performed for the common people. Her name, her rank, her connections made such a public unraveling too dangerous. The scandal already threatened to topple the delicate balance of Hungary's nobility. To drag a Báthory into the square would be to risk exposing the corruption of an entire system. Instead, her punishment was both quieter and crueler. She was condemned to disappear. György Thurzó, the Palatine who had once burst into her castle chambers, took it upon himself to carry out the sentence. Under his orders, Elizabeth was confined in a suite of rooms deep within the stone belly of Csejte Castle. Legends claim her windows were bricked up, leaving only a narrow slit through which food could be passed. Whether this detail was literal or symbolic hardly matters. The image is unforgettable. The woman who once stalked the gilded halls of power, now reduced to a shadow, entombed in her own fortress. At first, Elizabeth raged. She was no ordinary criminal to be discarded in silence. She wrote letters of protest, demanding the king honor his debts to her. She insisted upon her innocence, calling the accusations against her slander born of envy. To some extent, she was right. Much of what was said about her, bathing in blood, vampirism, was embroidered rumor, calculated to destroy her utterly. But if her letters revealed indignation, they also betrayed desperation. The Blood Countess, accustomed to obedience and luxury, had been stripped of her power. Her pen was her last weapon, and even that grew dull as her pleas were ignored. Outside her cell, the legend grew. Servants and peasants told stories of ghostly screams drifting from the castle walls, of strange shadows flickering in her bricked-up chambers. Priests warned their congregations that Elizabeth had been punished by God. Her beauty and wealth turned to ashes as a lesson against vanity and cruelty. The court in Vienna whispered of her monstrous appetites, even as noble families quietly rejoiced that their daughters were safe. Elizabeth's name had become larger than her person. She was no longer simply a countess, but a cautionary tale. Her accomplices had already been executed, their bodies displayed as evidence of justice served. Elizabeth, however, remained alive. Her punishment stretched over years, a slow unraveling rather than a swift end. Time, once her enemy, now became her tormentor. She had spent her life seeking eternal youth. Now she was forced to watch herself age in solitude, her beauty fading, her body weakening, her legend swelling beyond her control. The cruelest irony of all, she had pursued immortality, and she achieved it, not through blood, but through infamy. By 1613, her letters grew erratic. She complained of her declining health, of her body stiffening in the damp cold of her chambers. Her once commanding presence was reduced to frailty. No courtiers, no servants, no eager sycophants remained to assure her of her grandeur. Only the silence of stone walls, broken occasionally by the rattle of chains or the hollow footsteps of guards delivering food. The climax of Elizabeth's tragedy was not an explosive downfall, but a suffocating, drawn-out decay. In August 1614, a guard reported that she had complained of freezing hands and weakness. The next morning, she was found lying still in her chamber. Her long war with time finally ended. She was 54 years old. Her burial was no triumph, no public spectacle of repentance. At first, she was interred in the church at Csejte, but local villagers, outraged that a woman accused of such horrors should rest among them, demanded her body be removed. Ultimately, her remains vanished into uncertainty. Some say she was secretly reburied in the family crypt at Csejte, others that her bones were scattered, so that her restless spirit could never rise again. The truth is lost, and perhaps that is fitting. Even in death, Elizabeth Báthory remained elusive. a figure suspended between history and myth. But the legend did not die. On the contrary, it grew. Tales of the Blood Countess spread across Europe, twisting with each retelling. Some swore she had bathed in the blood of 600 virgins to preserve her beauty. Others claimed she had made pacts with dark forces, that her castle was cursed. In time, Elizabeth became less a historical figure than a Gothic archetype. The vampire countess, a monstrous woman whose cruelty rivaled the darkest imaginations of folklore. Her tragedy, then, was double-edged. She was destroyed by her own cruelty, or at least by the stories of it, and condemned to a punishment that denied her the very thing she had pursued: freedom, youth, admiration. But she was also destroyed by a system eager to consume her wealth and erase her debts. Was she truly the monster of legend? Or was she a woman caught between her vanity and the political machinations of men who found her convenient to condemn? That ambiguity is the beating heart of her story. In her final years, Elizabeth Báthory lived in a prison of stone, but in death, she was released into immortality. Her name, her legend, her myth travelled further than she ever could in life. She became the inspiration for Gothic novels, for vampire tales, for horror stories whispered in the dark. And in that sense, her pursuit of eternal youth was fulfilled. Not in flesh, but in the endless repetition of her story, century after century. The climax of her life was not the scream of a victim or the crash of an empire collapsing. It was the silence of a bricked-up chamber where one of Europe's most powerful women faded into nothingness, even as her myth began its rise. Elizabeth Báthory's story did not end with her bricked-up death chamber in Csejte Castle. In many ways, that was only the beginning. For centuries, her name has lingered in the European imagination, not as a noblewoman, not as a widow managing vast estates, but as a creature of nightmare, the Blood Countess, the woman who sought eternal youth in the most grotesque of ways. Her legend became inseparable from myth. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when Gothic literature blossomed, Elizabeth re-emerged as a dark muse. Writers and storytellers shaped her into an archetype, the vampiric noblewoman, the seductress who feeds on innocence. Bram Stoker's Dracula, though centered on another infamous figure, was haunted by echoes of her myth. Later, she became the inspiration for countless plays, novels, and horror films. To this day, her name is spoken alongside vampires, witches, and demons. But strip away the layers of horror, and another figure emerges, a woman of immense power in a time when women were expected to be silent. Elizabeth Báthory inherited vast lands, ruled over peasants, and wielded authority that rivaled many men. To some historians, her downfall was as much about her gender and her wealth as it was about her supposed crimes. Was she truly guilty of hundreds of murders, or was she destroyed by those eager to erase her debts, confiscate her estates, and silence a powerful widow? That question has never been answered, and perhaps never can be. The archives hold testimony wrung from tortured servants, letters written by Elizabeth in her final years, records of confiscated lands. But they do not hold the truth. And so, Elizabeth remains suspended between history and legend, between the cruelty of fact and the seduction of myth. Her legacy is unsettling because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Why do we remember Elizabeth as a monster while we forget the countless male tyrants who committed equal or greater atrocities? Why does her legend lean so heavily on her beauty, her vanity, her femininity, turning her into the archetype of the evil woman? Is her immortality the triumph of her own dark ambitions, or is it the product of a society eager to turn a woman into a myth of fear? Elizabeth Báthory wanted eternal youth, eternal beauty, eternal admiration. Instead, she achieved eternal infamy. Her name has outlived kingdoms, dynasties, even the walls of Csejte Castle. She became what she sought, immortal, not in the way she imagined, but in the way history so often delivers, through legend, through fear, and through the stories we cannot stop telling.